Thank everybody for your participation over the last 2 weeks. We had a lot of information, a lot of great ideas, and we've had a lot of exchange and a lot of your input, questions, comments, and suggestions. And I think we've all hopefully learned from our experiences these past 2 weeks. Just a couple housekeeping items. Again, reiterating that your videos will be turned off and you'll be muted during the presentation. As if you have questions, you just please enter those comments, questions in the chat box. At this time, I'd like to introduce the president of the Over Mountain Victory Trail Association, the host agency. I'd like to introduce David Doan, the president of the OVTA. David.
Thank you, RG. As you just mentioned, I am president of the Over Mountain Victory Trail Association. We call it OVTA. It's the Over Mountain Victory National Historic Trail, March to Kings Mountain. I'm also on the planning committee for this workshop as well, too. This has been a great learning experience for me. OVTA is the host organization for this workshop, and I wish we could have been able to do this in person because there were a lot of places along our trail we'd like to have taken you all to go and see. We also, our group would like to have stood in front of you and did our presentation as we would any other time when we do it in person. However, as we all know, the COVID-19 prevented this from happening. I'd like to thank all of you who have attended. I hope that you have gotten a lot of information, help, and ideas from what you have seen and heard. The presenters are excellent resources to use after this workshop too. Contact them. They'd be glad to help you. I was not able to attend all the sessions. The ones that I did were very good presentations and had a lot of information. Thank you all for all the presenters, coordinators, and people behind the scenes. Great job. There was a tremendous amount of time and planning that went on behind the scenes by a lot of people to plan this event and implement it. Once again, thanks to all of you. Now, I do have two people I'd like to have a little special recognition for, and they are R.G. Absher and Liz Wessel. These two are very good at planning all the aspects of what we had to do in order to put all this together. So I'd like to thank both of you from the deepest part of my heart. OVTA is planning our schedule next year. Our March, as always, will be starting on September the 12th at Sycamore Shows and in at Kings Mountain on October the 7th. These are the original dates of the March, and we follow these dates each year. Every one of you are invited to come and join us. October 15th, which was 2 weeks ago today, several of us were honored to be able to go and do the story for our Sullivan County Commissioners. The Commissioners presented a proclamation to John Adair of Sullivan County. Adair was the county entry taker in 1780. He gave the county funds to Colonel Shelby and Sevier to fund the trip to Kings Mountain. We also had in attendance the county school system director as well as the chairman of the school board. And we've been working with these two men for a while trying to make our presentation a classroom and not a field trip. That way it gives more opportunity for our students to see the many things that we offer in our areas. Most all counties along the trail in North Carolina require their systems to attend our program. Of course, with these COVID restrictions, it's hard to confirm the dates at this time, but we will start doing school programs as soon as these guidelines will let us do so. And we're doing some programs right now. 10 of us were at Hart Square Village, close to Hickory, North Carolina this past Saturday. Good event, but the attendance was small because of the virus. We will do programs and events this coming year at Cowpens National Battlefield, Kings Mountain National Military Park, other national and state historic sites, school systems, and a variety of other sites. I'm looking forward to attending a future workshop. Hopefully it'll be in person next time. once again, thanks to all. RG.
Thanks, David. And at this time, I'd like to acknowledge all of our planning team committee members. Kelly Van Patten from the Florida Trails Association, David Doan, of course, from the OVTA, likewise Tom Vaughn and Leanne Hunter as well from the OVTA, Dolores Graywood from the Trail of Tears Association, Don Owen, Virginia Fowler, National Park Service, William Caldwell, National Park Service, and Sarah Cunningham, National Park Service. Christopher Dallas, Federal Highways Administration, Philip Marley, U.S. Forest Service, Sean Thomas, U.S. Forest Service, and Liz Wessel, PNTS staff. And then I'd also like to thank the JEDI work group, the leadership planning session team. I'd like to thank the workshop and conference committee, and Luke Cloberdance, Teresa Martinez, Cleo Pack, Barney Mann, Valerie Root for their assistance planning the workshop. Additionally, I'd like to remember the sponsors and acknowledge their tremendous contribution in making this workshop possible. The list of sponsors is on the screen. At this time, I'll hand the reins over to Valerie to continue our final workshop session today. Thank you.
Thanks, RG. I'm happy to announce Dylan McDowell, who will be giving us the final presentation of the session today. Dylan McDowell works at the intersection of science and policy. Originally trained as a science communicator, he is now Deputy Director of the National Caucus of Environmental Legislators, where he supports state lawmakers across the country on a range of conservation and environmental policies. Dylan was selected in 2018 as a shift emerging leader for outdoor conservation and has served as the program's advisory council since. He lives in Salem, Oregon, where he is a chair of the city's Parks and Recreation Board and can often be found hiking, running, and on his paddleboard. In this presentation, Dylan will provide us with insight about what is happening at the state level and will provide us with an overview of opportunities to partner with states through initiatives like the 30 by 30, which we've heard about several times during this session, during this workshop, which seeks to conserve 30% of land and water by 2030. Also, he'll be talking about Great American Outdoors Act, wildlife connectivity, outdoor access, health, equity, to name a few. Please join me in welcoming Dylan.
Thank you so much, Valerie. Let me just get my screen share and I will jump right in. All right, I hope everyone can see my screen, and please let me know if that is not the case. But it is wonderful to be here with you all today. As Valerie mentioned, my name is Dylan McDowell, and I work at the National Caucus of Environmental Legislators. We are a nationwide network of state legislators from across the country that serves as a resource for shared learning and action on environmental issues. And one of the projects I run is the outdoor working group that we have at NCEL. There's currently about 15 states, legislators from 15 participating in that. And it's really about shared best practices of how they can advance outdoor engagement policies and connect with groups like yours, partners on the ground, and some of the successes that we're seeing in different states. My goal today is to walk through a few different things. First, I want to provide just a little bit of a landscape of the state policy environment right now, talk about a few examples at the state level, and then end with some partnership opportunities that I've seen that I think are relevant for everyone here. Please put any questions you have into the chat. I'm going to try and leave plenty of time for questions and discussion at the end, because I know that's very fruitful and it's great to hear from you about what's most helpful. With that, there we go. So I always like to start with a slide just laying out what state legislatures are like. I think many people don't realize the differences between the state and federal government and how they're set up. So 40 of the 50 state legislatures are part-time. And in some cases like Nevada, Montana, that means they meet every other year. Some cases they meet for 30 or 60 days a year. So it's very limited. And many of them get paid very little. There's a few exceptions like California, but New Mexico receives no salary. New Hampshire gets $100 a year that was written into their state constitution way back when. They have all these examples where state legislators are not only working part-time, they're not getting paid very much, and they have very little staff. You'll see in many cases, there's no year-round staff to help them make sense of all these issues. So meanwhile, they're balancing healthcare, criminal justice reform, and this whole umbrella environmental issues. And they're trying to do this with very limited capacity. And so I think that context is really important because contrary to the federal level, state legislators really want to be partners and they want to work with you on what these good ideas are and hear what your thoughts are because they are in need of that kind of solution-oriented thinking when you approach them. But it's also important to note that state legislatures very often go on to the federal level. So you can see the stats here, about 45% of the chamber has served in a state legislature before. So as you build up champions at the state level, very often that can translate to the federal level and create things like the Great Americas Act. And finally, I want to note this concept of laboratories of democracy. There are so many examples of how state legislatures and the policies that start at the states make their way to the level. Things there, wonderful funding mechanism, equity provisions, all kinds of different policies that then can become a national model that we have as a country. So never underestimate, and this includes local policies too. And I know many of you work at the local level, as mentioned in my bio. I'm chair of the Parks and Recreation in the city of Salem, and so much that can then work its way up the system. I imagine it's no surprise that COVID is right now the name of the game in terms of state legislatures. There's budget deficits that are being faced, especially in the possibility of stimulus coming down. And so as a result, as state legislators look at policies, there's an emphasis on co-benefits. What are the health, jobs, equity, and education components of the work that you're doing? And thankfully, we're seeing that outdoor engagement opportunities, especially including trails, cultural sites, many of the things that you all work on, have a really big overlap with these components. There's opportunities for outdoor education as to have access for school classrooms, equity provisions and getting underserved communities outdoors, jobs and trail maintenance. You have health benefits of mental wellness, and we're seeing this with veterans to youth and all over the board. And we're seeing some examples already. In the Pacific Northwest, you're seeing these conservation core programs that are using COVID recovery spending to expand that. And so you're creating jobs, but you're also making sure to address trail recovery, wildfire maintenance, all kinds of different provisions that are very timely in the situation we're in. And North Carolina and other states are using funding, including CARES Act, to support outdoor education through grant programs and other ways of lifting up nonprofits and school boards that are trying to have outdoor engagement immersive opportunities. So I say this because as we look into this next session, it's a question mark whether there's even going to be in-person sessions for a lot of legislatures, at least to start. And so trying to think about how can the work that you're doing tie into some of these conversations, I think that'll be really appreciated. But I also want to note that many states are actually really organizing right around this idea of outdoor recreation or trails. And it's an exciting time because most of these caucuses, I think all of them are actually bipartisan. And what we're seeing is that in these states, they're going out and they're using a chance to go out to hike trails in their communities, take legislators from one district to another to show them what the state has to offer, to learn about the opportunities. And I would encourage you, if you're in one of these states, and I'm sure there's more that I don't have on my list here, to get in touch with these caucuses. Very often they're actually run by groups that are outside of the legislature or advised by those groups. And it's an opportunity for you to work with them and bring them out to your sites in particular and show them the meaning of why it's valuable. And I will note that Ohio and Indiana, theirs are specifically trails caucuses. So this is an increasing idea across the country. And as I mentioned, very bipartisan. So let's talk about a few state and federal efforts that are specifically relevant. I did have a chance earlier this week to attend a couple of the sessions, and it was wonderful to have some insight into the work that you're all doing and some of the partnership discussions out there. I know one thing that's on everyone's mind right now is the Great American Outdoors Act. This is a wonderful example of bipartisan legislation signed just this summer. And the most important component here is permanent funding for the Land and Water Conservation Fund. And this is going to open up immense opportunities for states and localities to fund some of the conservation work that many of you are doing. But with that is coming a lot of questions. How do we prioritize? Who's going to get the money? There's going to be a mad rush for this. And I think a lot of people are trying to figure out how their projects can fit in. So once again, it's really important to think about those co-benefits and how your work can be part of this larger strategy as we try and build back from what's happened with COVID and wildfires in the West and all these different things that we're facing in the country right now. I think another benefit, though, is just to note that we have this bipartisan support at a time where the federal government has been stagnant on many policies. And so it really underscores that there's an opportunity to move forward. I see Liz just posted in the chat this LWCF Coalition website. They're a wonderful resource if you have not visited that already, because you can go there and see projects in your state that are already underway. And you can also get a resource, a directory of who to contact in your state. So here's an example. If you go to the Washington page, you get to their Recreation and Conservation Office, and you can find on their grants under LWCF a list of the timeline of the grant schedule. Over on the right here, you can see resources for the applications to-do list, what's new in the system right now in the program. There's 2 different forms of state grants that are given out, one for larger cities and one for general funding. And so I would encourage everyone, if you haven't already, to be looking at these timelines, because I think that there's going to be a big rush for this funding, but I think it's also a really great opportunity for us to tie in these concepts that you've been talking about at the forum so far in terms of equity, ensuring everyone has access, and really tying in some of the cultural conversations. I want to note a few other examples of how states are looking at funding for outdoor programs. I think many of you are probably familiar that you can have all the good ideas in the world to get legislators on board, but funding is one of the things that holds us back. That's where LWCF really presents some wonderful opportunities. A few other examples. So Alaska, they are using CARES Act funding for their Conservation Corps program, specifically around trails maintenance. If you do a search for Juneau and in Anchorage, they both enacted this. California had a massive bond measure a few years ago with $4.1 billion for state and local parks preservation and programming. Georgia redirected some of their sales tax from outdoor gear specifically to land protection. New Mexico has this innovative outdoor equity fund where private businesses and foundations can actually contribute money to help to tie into this grant program that's also augmenting state funds to get youth outside. And then Oregon has the Conservation and Recreation Fund, where they're taking general fund dollars to match private philanthropy. So a one-to-one dollar match, which is providing a new incentive to get more of the public involved, but then also make sure some of the state money backs that up. And so these are just a few examples. I'll talk about the equity fund and a little bit more in a moment here. But I think it's important to note that each state is getting creative, and it's not just the blue states like California with giant bond measures, but we're seeing more and more opportunities to fund these efforts across the country. A few policy specifics I'd like to highlight, because I think we're starting to think outside the box and really get back to this co-benefit idea. There is the federal Every Kid in a Park program many of you may be familiar with. Several states, including Nevada, are now granting free entry to state parks for students of a certain age, such as 4th or 5th graders, 9 to 11. And this provides an opportunity to reduce one of the barriers, costs, that many families have of getting outside. In New York, they have the Outdoor RX bill. This is really about coordination at the state government level about the division's state parks, lands, and the veteran services, but they're creating a report and looking at how they can reduce inefficiencies and identify barriers that they can break down in coming sessions. While it might not be the most attractive policy in terms of getting things done immediately, this kind of planning is something that can be really popular in the coming year where budgets are tough. And then you create a really good roadmap to go ahead and figure out how you can better engage the trail systems in your state, and especially looking at some of the user groups like veterans, youth, disadvantaged communities that might not have access. Colorado and several other states have public lands days. I think it's about 6 or 7 states now. And the reason I use Colorado is they have a very effective website, and they've done a lot of communication around their public lands days. And including events at different parks. They have all huge press events, opportunities. I know their Office of Outdoor Recreation has been really involved in this. And so it provides an opportunity for you to tie into these already established communication efforts to raise awareness for the work that you're doing, and then also get more of the public involved. And Utah has a similar initiative with the Every Kid Outdoors effort. They have put some funding behind it with a one-time grant program, but there's also just a focus on healthy, active lifestyle for youth. So once again, tying in some of these concepts of health alongside youth, and really all boiling down to time outside on trails. So 2 quick policy spotlights here. One is No Child Left Inside. This was a program Washington State pioneered. It provides grants to outdoor engagement to underserved and low-income youth. Nonprofits, schools, public agencies, community-based groups are all eligible. So I think many of the people on this call would be part of that. And you can see from the numbers here, they have funded tons of projects, many hours of education. And I'll note that they are always having more applications than they can fund. So it's been a great success that the state keeps funding. So successful, in fact, that Nevada and Minnesota have established similar programs, and Hawaii and Ohio actually have active bills to replicate this idea. And it's an opportunity. In Minnesota, there's been some really exciting case studies and articles written. Their program has been very effective with the tribal nations. And there was a wonderful story about students that had never gone ice fishing, even though it was a big part of their culture. They were Native American students. And through this grant program, they were able to get out into the area that they'd never been and go ice fishing and experience that for the first time. And so I think this is a really important opportunity as more states can have small grant programs just to really break down that barrier and get them to some of the trails, cultural sites, other areas that you're using. It's something that is a really great value and investment. Very similar example is this outdoor equity fund that I mentioned. One thing that's notable about the New Mexico example is it was tied into their Office of Outdoor Recreation. And I'll talk about these in just a moment, but if you're not familiar, several states have now created offices of outdoor recreation to better coordinate the efforts across the state. And this New Mexico effort, it allows small grants to purchase equipment, staff time, park fees, all kinds of ways of reducing barriers. They had $100,000 from the state, and they ended up raising about $160,000 from private individuals, foundations, organizations all across the board that chipped in. And they just gave out their first round of grants. I think most were around the $5,000 to $10,000 range, and they gave out about 28 organizations that received funding. So it's going to be really exciting to see those projects go into effect and help students in New Mexico go across the state to areas they've never been. And it's really important to note that U.S. Senator Martin Heinrich is actually looking at this now and others about how can other states replicate this equity fund, but then how can the federal government try and do something similar? So we're getting people to the wonderful spaces that you work on. And I see someone in the chat here mentioned Oregon's Outdoor School for All. That's another wonderful example. Outdoor education opportunities are fantastic. And Oregon has their Outdoor School for All that provides outdoor learning for 5th and 6th graders. And they have spent several days outdoors and it's managed through the Extension Office in Oregon. And that one's funded through lottery dollars, which I didn't have mentioned earlier on my funding slide. So thank you so much, John, for referencing that. So a few quick partnership opportunities to touch on. I know the federal and state 30 by 30 movement is something that's coming up more and more. And as mentioned, this effort to conserve 30% of land and water by 2030. This has been led federally by Senator Udall and Representative Holland. And there's been some state efforts so far. California, Governor Newsom had an executive order to start planning for 30 by 30. South Carolina and Hawaii both had bills that would start the process. They were smaller in scope than California, but it's a starting point in terms of getting the conversation going. And what we're seeing as we talk with legislators right now about 30 by 30 is there is a lot of interest in moving this forward and figuring out what it looks like, but there's very few solutions just already written out. So this is very much in the development stage, and there's groups actively coming to the table to figure out how their priorities and the work that they're already doing fits into that 30 by 30 goal. And I think that everyone on this call, everyone at this conference, working with trails, cultural spaces, natural areas, you are so well equipped to be part of that solution. So I would encourage all of you to think about how can the trails and cultural spaces you work on be part of that. I'll give 2 examples. One is tribal communities and another is wildlife areas are already working with state legislators about how the areas they manage can be expanded or included in these 30 by 30 goals. And so this is a real opportunity to keep an eye out. I think we're going to see a lot more op-eds, state public statements, conversations at the state legislative and city level about how their work can tie into this. And those leaders are really hungry for new ideas. So make sure you're having those conversations early. Another to note is wildlife connectivity. So the state and federal government have both proposed wildlife corridors and crossings to increase connectivity across the country. And we're seeing more and more trails being a valuable part of this. So there's a Pennsylvania resolution in the works that talks about wildlife connectivity, but it specifically mentions the value of trails. And 9 states are working on this. And I know that in Virginia, actually there's 10 because I don't have Virginia on this list. They're working on this and they're also looking to get some funding for trails as part of their wildlife connectivity effort. So if you're not already thinking about interactions with the wildlife community, they're really good partners right now. They're actively working with state legislators, both in terms of 30 by 30, but also with connectivity and wildlife corridors. I think all of these can be really great signs of overlap and collaboration on state-based coalitions. Finally, I want to mention these offices of outdoor recreation again. So several states have created these, more are on the way, trying to create them right now. And we're seeing the scope of these are broadening. it's not just necessarily about the economic impact of outdoor recreation, but how can we create coalitions at the state level and really think about outdoor engagement as a whole? In Washington State, the Office of Outdoor Recreation, the advisor, helped actually create the outdoor preschool model. So getting back to education, they have licensed outdoor preschools across the state. In New Mexico, the Office of Outdoor Recreation was tied in with this equity fund. This is another example of broadening the scope of who's really being served. In Oregon, the Office of Outdoor Recreation led a very large stakeholder mapping process where they created a report that has about 30 recommendations that include everything from equity provisions to getting youth outside, to outdoor jobs and conservation. And that is now bought into as something that the legislature can work towards with these different recommendations that have been laid out. And so if you're not already, I would really recommend that you get involved. Most of these offices are run by a single FTE, a single individual that's in charge of them, and they're very open to figuring out how they can be that linchpin between the different efforts across the state. So with that, I want to leave plenty of time for some questions and any questions you might have in the chat or any discussion. I'll point out a few different resources. I have a couple links here. One is policies that support recreation and access that we've been highlighting across the country. We have our website on outdoor recreation at NCEL. And NCEL has also partnered with several organizations on the Outdoor Policy Playbook. This Youth Outdoor Policy Playbook has case studies for many of the policies I talked about. It also has a compendium of different ideas that you could consider. And I know that youth outdoors is only a segment of who we want to get outdoors, clearly the larger population, but it's a wonderful place to start in terms of building conservation champions of tomorrow, and then also figuring out how you can expand those policies to include everyone. So with that, I will stop, and I think Valerie is going to help us with some Q&A.
Great. Anyone would please put their questions in the chat so we can start picking Dylan's brain on all of these wonderful things he presented to us. I know it usually takes a moment or two to get started on the question, so I might pose one to you in the meantime.
Yeah, absolutely.
So how would, many of our trails run across multiple states. So do you have any tips about, how to bring together efforts across state boundaries for trails?
That's a really good question. I know that depending on the state, some regions work together better than others. Living in Oregon, for example, I know that there's a lot of value when one state can say another state is working on the same thing. So in Oregon and Washington right now, I know both of those states are looking at these conservation core models, how they could increase that to better address the wildfire damages. And getting those legislators talking between states is something that we work on a lot to make sure that they know what's happening, because they're often not aware. And I know that if you start approaching legislators and say that this trail goes across both states and X state is already working on it, you should as well, it really does help build up that case, because I cannot tell you the number of times that I've gone to a legislator in a neighboring state and said, they've told me they're working on a policy, and I'll say, actually, that's being done next door. You should talk to this legislator. And then they can coordinate their efforts, think about the funding opportunities, and it helps too with the press. I don't want to make it all about media, but in terms of thinking about media opportunities to highlight the work that's happening, it's really powerful when you can say 2 or 3 states are jointly working on a project, especially when it's something like outdoor engagement that's universally popular.
All right, and if you could please put the questions in the chat. They're not coming up right now. I'm not getting a feed. I'm sure they're coming in though, so let me see what's.
And I see some, Naomi posted about the national parks just allowed free access to 5th graders. And I think that's a wonderful program. And as I mentioned, some of the states are trying to increase that. I think the question that does remain, and something that many of you are probably wrestling with, is once you're at the park, you get access, which is wonderful, but making sure that students, especially kids from the inner city, from urban areas, can actually get to the park. And I think this transportation question is something a lot of states are still wrestling with. There's a few examples on the education front. I know New York has a grant program where they'll reimburse teachers for field trips to go to different parks and natural areas. I know that the Equity Fund in New Mexico, for example, can help with those transportation dollars. And I think that's a nexus point that we really have to think about in terms of the equity provisions as we're trying to build these new programs and get people to these wonderful sites, is how do we make sure to actually get those dollars up front to help the communities get there?
Great, thank you. So we have a question about any speculation on the impact of COVID on the amount of money available for state budgets, priorities affected, etc.
It's a really great question. I think a lot of states are still figuring out their forecasts, depending on which state you're in. I think some of the forecasts are out. In some cases, it's not as bad as it may have been. I think there's been some positive signs. Depending on the state you're in, though, there's the transportation dollars that are usually, in Oregon, for example, we have something called transportation occupancy funds, TOT. And given the fact that people are not traveling as much, people are not staying in hotels like they would have been over the last year, that funding has gone down a lot. And as a result, that funding tends to be what comes to a lot of our communities in terms of outdoor to park systems and for trails and things like that. So individual sources of funding can get hit really hard. And I think it's also going to be really hard to come with new proposals for funding. So if you wanted to create a brand new outdoor school program for all, or an equity fund, it's a grant program, that's where the more we can think about co-benefits of, this is not just about getting kids outside, but this is about getting kids outside who were not able to get outside for the last year, or how can we tie that to our school programs? So they're doing outdoor field trips that tie into the communities that we have, but we're also helping support education, because we know right now that they're really they're having a lot of challenges how to make up for lost time. And so I do think we're going to keep seeing more and more of an unfortunate budget picture. And another thing that I think is important to recognize is, because of the remote nature of some of the legislatures and how they start, there's the possibility that there will be a reduction in some of the bills that are run. So in many years, for those that aren't as familiar at the state level, usually during the odd years, so 2021, it's the longer sessions. And that's where states will meet for 4, 5, 6 months, depending on the state. Whereas in even years, some states don't meet at all, and others only meet for a shortened amount of time. And so usually these long sessions give you the opportunity to have really robust policy making, a lot more opportunity for discussion. And that might be truncated a little bit this year. And so that's where I think the collaboration with groups like wildlife organizations, tribal nations groups that are already working on some of these initiatives will be more important than ever to help combine your efforts into stronger bills.
Thank you. So we have another question since many state budgets will be affected by lower revenue over the next year, what policy priorities could state coalitions work on, since many state legislatures will be reticent to approve a new fund or state financial support for trails? This is kind of dovetailing on what you were just mentioning.
Absolutely. I really think this 30 by 30 planning is something that can be really important. And I think setting the stage in terms of whether there are as simple as state resolutions or something, I think we might see some more of. And resolutions, they don't have teeth. They're not the most attractive in some ways, but they can help set the stage in terms of what the state should have. So Nebraska just passed a Children's Bill of Rights, and I think it just passed in August in their legislature. And that is really saying that every child in Nebraska should have the ability to go outside to a trail. They should have the ability to have outdoor learning as part of their childhood. And so some of these vision setting bills, I think, can be really important. Even though you might not get the money, you can at least set the framework to say, this is something we really care about. In Ohio, a few years ago, in 2018, when they created their Outdoor Trails Caucus, they designated 2018 as the year of the trails. And their Department of Natural Resources in Ohio created an incredible map of all the different trails in the state. And it was something the Republican there, who was the co-sponsor of it, he said, I am really adamant that we're not going to add new money to the budget with this. This is something they can do with their existing resources. And they were able to. And so that created an opportunity to highlight the trails you had in the state. It created awareness about the importance of trails. And so these kind of strategies, I think, will be more important than ever as we're looking at a tough budget year, but everyone's recreating locally right now. They're trying to find those opportunities in their state that they've never been to. So how can, at the state level, both local, state, and administration officials help facilitate that?
Great, thank you. So the next question is, the Michigan Office of Outdoor Recreation Industry is focused on larger recreational industries like ski resorts and supporting gear manufacturing. As a nonprofit that provides a recreational resource, we're struggling to getting industry to support our work, even though they rely on our resources for their business. Any suggestions?
That's a really good question. I would argue that I think the winds are changing on that a little bit, especially as we see more and more challenges to these recreation industries of people maybe not. A lot of them are seeing people going outside, but there's issues in terms of the recreation industry of people staying in certain areas. And I think, as I was mentioning with the offices of outdoor recreation, we're seeing more of a focus on how can they broaden the scope of who's at the table. And I think that this is where pointing to some of the other examples of you can actually expand your coalition, your constituency to all these new users that might have never gone skiing, for example. And by getting kids from the city that have never gone skiing or people that have never experienced it otherwise, you can bring new people in, and you can also tie it to this COVID recovery idea of mental health, getting people outside for those reasons. So I think it's important to point to some of those examples in other states like New Mexico and Washington of how this has been done. So it's not just a completely brand new idea, but to say, here, look, this is how some states are trying to broaden this table there. And I think groups like REI have done a wonderful job of changing their messaging, and they're worth looking into. Even the Outdoor Industry Association, which helps stand up these offices and is the association for all these manufacturers, they have been increasing their conversations around equity as a keystone of what they need to do. And so I think tying it back to some of these national conversations and other state efforts is really important to make sure it's grounded in reality.
Great. So the next question is, how is climate change framing these discussions at the state level, particularly in states where this has become a decisive issue? Are states looking for long-term challenges in outdoor rec and access to public spaces, landscapes?
That's a really good question, especially the part about political division. I think one thing that I would argue outdoor recreation has above most other issues, and we saw with the Great American Outdoors Act, is that you can get a very bipartisan coalition on board. And it is a case where I think climate is honestly one of those co-benefits, but there's these immediate benefits that we need to address in terms of COVID, in terms of just giving people an opportunity to recreate locally. And so I think if you frame it in the sense of finding people like these trails caucuses where there's bipartisan support and people love to get outside, and you can start there and say, we want to create and protect these natural areas to make sure more people can get outside. Everyone has that opportunity. And that might include planting more trees for carbon drawdown. That might include making sure we're protecting it from a climate standpoint. And you can work your way into those issues. But I think if you can get the people outside, and I will note many of these caucuses involve ending at a brewery, because everyone loves going for a hike and then getting some beer afterwards. And I think that kind of easing into the issue is proving a lot more successful in these states than just trying to come at it right about climate from the start, but really starting with, we know you love to be outside. Here's how what we're working on is going to help with that. And here's how the climate change issue plays a role in that.
Great. So the next question is please discuss the best way to spend the limited amount of time and resources of a nonprofit has. Is it better to develop strong relationships with state staff or with legislators? State staff stick around a longer time, and that seems to make building relationships with legislators better than the short-term legislators.
That's a really good point. And I will note this depends a little bit on the state that you're in terms of the structure of state staff, and also if there's term limits in the legislators, sorry. I think that both are important. I definitely think that making sure state staff know who you are is very important, because they're the ones that are doing all the hard work behind the scenes. But there's so much to be said for what legislators can do when they come in for the first term, when they get a new idea when they have a brand new idea of this innovative policy, and they come in and they can work with their colleagues. After about 2016, I mean, really before then, but since 2016 in particular, we're seeing such a new diverse cadre of legislators coming in. So many younger legislators, so many legislators from diverse backgrounds, whether it's tribal backgrounds, Latina, coming from Asian American communities, Black communities, and they're bringing these new perspectives and professional backgrounds that I think they're excited to try something new and go big and bold. And so those kind of legislators, if you can find one that is in your district or one that you know is interested, can be a champion for these ideas, that fostering that one relationship is so important. In New Hampshire, for example, there's a state senator that's interested in environmental education. And I was able to connect him with some environmental education association there just last week. And he is just so excited to run a bill on this and figure out how we can make it happen. And sometimes it really takes finding that one relationship, but it can help shepherd through some of these innovative ideas and make sure you're on the right track. Oh, Valerie, you're on mute there.
Oh, my apologies. I was just saying that we have a few comments coming in, so I'm just pulling that up. I believe that was already addressed. Sorry, Liz and I were just communicating. We have a nice little setup going back and forth with questions. So we could have time for one or two more questions if anyone would like to ask some more. And in the meantime, I will just read a few comments that came in during this time. That one is from Cindy, and that is saying that CAJO's partner, Chesapeake Conservancy, and there's 30 program. She was sharing some resources about that. So if there's anything you wanted to talk about with CAJO and the Chesapeake Conservancy. And then also John had mentioned, you had mentioned his comment about Oregon passing statewide outdoor school for all as well. If there's anything that you'd want to highlight on those.
I think the Chesapeake Conservancy and 30 by 30, I mean, it just really underscores so many conversations are happening, and this is such an active issue. I've been amazed to see how much uptake there is and how many legislators are just fascinated by this idea. But they're not, like I said, they're not exactly sure what it means in practice. It's some issues you can come at it with things like equity, where you still have to figure out a lot of the framework of what works for your state. But there are some examples like No Child Left Inside or the Equity Fund or access in schools that you can start from. But I think 30 by 30 is a relatively new concept in terms of trying to tie all these pieces together in a new framework. And so that's where I think the work that you're all doing here in terms of the trails and cultural space preservation, expansion, protection, that is such a key part of it. And it's so important to have those voices heard. So I know League of Conservation Voters, a lot of other groups have started taking this on very quickly. And I think that figuring out who the in-state folks are working on 30 by 30 is going to be an important aspect, because using limited time, but also making sure your priorities are part of that, because everyone's creating this roadmap together. And I think over the next 6 months, that'll be a collective effort.
Thank you. Actually, just another question about the 30 for 30 campaign by 30 campaign is, how far of a stretch is that? How much do you know approximately how much is already protected out of the 30%?
Good question. I don't have a good number off the top of my head. I mean, I think that it's, I'm just going to see if I could pull up, I'll see if I can find some resources to share afterwards, but I think that it's really important to have a North Star, even if we have to adjust our timelines accordingly as we get towards it. But I think that it's really good for us to figure out. I think the thing that's most important in my mind in terms of the 30 by 30 work is it's looking at land preservation in a new way, thinking about who are the stakeholders that need to be at the table. How do we make sure this is about more than just protecting land? Thinking about some of the equity provisions, thinking about relationships with tribal communities and the cultural aspects. And so I think that it's a really great opportunity for us to just rethink our whole system of how we're protecting and providing access to the land that we do protect, and making sure it's working for multiple stakeholders. And so even if we don't reach 30% by 2030, I would hope that we're close, and that we are also creating this more equitable process for how we're providing that land protection.
And we actually have a quick comment from Jeremy Call, which is saying from nclel.net, a 2018 study found that 12% of the country's land and 26% of the ocean territory is protected. However, 97% of the marine area is located in remote Pacific Ocean territory. So,
thank you, Jeremy, for going to our website. Yeah. That's why I was going to send that link. I didn't want to give the wrong numbers. So.
This group is always working together and on it. And then one last question we have from Ellen. Actually, might be able to squeeze in one more after this, but we'll see how long it takes to answer. So please take your time. Can you talk about trillion trees?
I can mention it briefly. I think that trees play a really important role right now. So I don't want to discount trees. I think that needs to be part of the solution and not the solution. And I think that one of the examples that I would pivot to a little bit is in Maryland. They're looking at their climate adaptation plans. And one of the things they've talked about is how can you use some of this climate adaptation money to develop parks and green spaces within urban areas like Baltimore. And in those cases, we know that trees can reduce the heat island effect, they can provide higher property values, they provide community wellness benefits, community areas, they provide beauty. There's all these benefits. And so I think the more we can provide trees as part of this climate solution, but also part of this community enrichment solution, there's so much value there, and that has to be part of the solution. But I think it needs to be a piece of a larger puzzle that includes all these other aspects we've talked about.
It's interesting that you use Maryland as an example, because the person posing that question is actually a Marylander. So very well done. All right, so we are at 10:02. So I think, if we're we're near the end of our time together. So thank you so much. And if there's any parting words you'd like to say, we so appreciate your time with us and really look forward to working with you in the future.
Well, thank you so much. I really appreciate you inviting me, and I hope this was informative for everyone, and just would underscore that, you know, state legislators, they are so accessible compared to the federal counterparts, and they're excited to hear from you and be partners with you as you're working on these efforts together.
Great.
And reach out to me if there's any additional questions, please.
Thank you so much.
All right, thank you all.
All right, so now we are here. Here we are at the end of our first virtual workshop. So thank you so much for being a part of it. This workshop was a little different than our previous workshops. It was thematic in structure, and it was offered online. As a partnership, we're here to work together and to sustain and improve the national scenic and historic trails, and to support you. Please complete the workshop survey to share your thoughts and feedback on it. And of course, please feel free to contact me with ideas for the partnership's work, or to tell me about your work on national trails. I was asked to recap the sessions, and I admit that I struggled to limit my list to a few examples. During the workshop, we heard about practical examples and best practices. We were encouraged to recognize that a big vision for a trail requires us to think outside the traditional boundaries and traditional values. We heard about partners raising one another up and highlighting long under-prioritized stories of people and nations throughout our trail system. We heard stories that were both heart-wrenching and heartwarming. We started many important dialogues that we must continue. So to wrap up, one technique that I've used in the past for program reflection is called glows, grows, and shout-outs. It's a simple way to ask people to share their takeaways in a manner that reflects their own experience. So for instance, a glow may be something wonderful that you'd like to acknowledge. A grow is an opportunity for more work or improvement. And a shout out is a way to acknowledge a person, a eureka moment, or something that was done well. And I want to hear about your glows, grows, and shout outs. The summary of what I just described will be provided in the chat for your convenience. To get us started, I'll share one of each with you. My glow was our involvement with the Trail Apprentices in this workshop. If they and our next generation panel are the future of our trails, we have a very bright future ahead. A grow is putting into practice the concepts discussed during the JEDI sessions, specifically looking at ways to ensure the partnership continues to evolve to better pursue the goal of an inclusive and accessible national trail system for all. And my shout out goes to all of you for spending your time with us at this workshop and learning, exchanging, and growing with one another. So now it's your turn. I'd like to ask you to put in the chat a glow, a grow, a shout out, more than one if you'd like, and I'd like to share some of them with the group. Okay, so we have a grow that has more personal work on JEDI. And a glow is, I love starting with the RDI topic. Great. Very bright future with the interns. Yes, very much so. A grow is more effective use of technology. And just a shout out to RG Apshire. A shout out to Caleb, Chelsea, and Liz, and anyone else in the background. You all are amazing. Absolutely agree there. A glow, an incredibly well-run and managed set of workshops. A grow would be love to see all the trail apprentices introduced and highlighted in this setting. I think that's a great idea. We're wrapping up now, but we can certainly look to do that in one of our upcoming newsletters or something along those lines. JEDI is moving in the right direction, and that we need to further facilitate that. Shout out to Jose, a great choice for a speaker and facilitator. More kudos for Liz, who absolutely deserves them. Shout out to the members who lean on each other and learn, develop, and apply. Absolutely. A little more about JEDI. We need to be open to all users, including those who are with limited mobility. That's a very good point. Absolutely. A glow for the keynote speaker, Jose. I wish he were here to hear this. I'll have to make sure to send him these notes. A glow to the fundraising session. We learned a lot. Absolutely agree. I would say that was one of the ones that I've sat through a lot of fundraising sessions, and rarely do I come out feeling inspired, and I really did with that one session. Ditto for the trail apprentices. Absolutely. Thanks for giving us more tools to glow, grow, and shout out. Shout out, great turnout to all the trail partners. A glow is appreciated the social time yesterday. Oh, that's great. For those of you who couldn't attend, we had some breakout sessions that were a lot of fun yesterday afternoon. A grow would be, I'd like to see PNTS user group created where users could be asked of other trail organizations to build on shared knowledge and experiences. That's a great idea. I love that. Shout out, fantastic job. I'd like to hear that trails are not just for through hikers and users. That was very much keyed into our themes of talking about inclusion, not just including all types of hikers. All right. Glow to the use of breakouts in Jedi and the social. Great. Liz for the logistical master coordinator. Another shout out. Shout out to PNTS and all involved in organizing the conference. Thank you for adapting the circumstances and keeping our community together. And shout out to Jose for the keynote. Trails are for everyone. Yep, absolutely. And even though we would love to have met in person, the virtual platform permitted lots of my colleagues to participate. So thank you for that. Very good point in terms of accessibility. Our challenge is to replace federal funding with our operating costs in the 12 months starting April 2021. With income from dues and donations. Ideas for this conference will be put to good use here. Great. Shout out to NCTA for having so many staff and volunteers attend. Absolutely. A grow would be agree if this is an opportunity to reach new audiences that maybe have been exposed to the national trails during the pandemic. I have told many users that the Nez Perce National Historic Trail offers lots of great social distancing opportunities. Very true. Wow. They just keep coming. This is fantastic. So we're actually nearing our time, but we're going to be sharing these recorded sessions, and there will be, the chat will be with it. So we'll get to see more. And actually, if you didn't notice, as much as we love engaging with this is also a great way for us to solicit some feedback from all of you on your experience in the workshop. In a little different way than the survey would permit us to do. So thank you very much. Even as we're participating in this workshop, the Partnership and American Hiking Society are hard at work at our next event, Hike the Hill. I hope to see you all at that event. It will be held virtually in March 2021, and you'll be receiving a save the date notification in late November. And with that, I thank you so much for spending your time with us during this workshop. Please give yourself a virtual round of applause. We can't do this without you. Thank you so much.